Get out of the damn car right now before I drag you out myself, you ungrateful little brat. My father's face was completely purple with rage as he slammed on the brakes. The heavy tires of our SUV skidded violently against the gravel shoulder of Interstate 15. We were not at a gas station. We were not at a rest stop. We were in the absolute middle of the blistering Nevada desert, with the afternoon sun baking the asphalt at over 100 degrees. I am Harper. I am 31 years old, and today I am the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Innovations, which is a billion-dollar tech logistics firm. But 15 years ago, I was just a 16-year-old girl being thrown out of a vehicle onto the side of a highway by the people who were supposed to protect me. We were on a cross-country road trip to drop my golden child older sister Madison at her ridiculously expensive private college in California. I had been sitting in the cramped back seat for 6 straight hours, holding my knees to my chest. I politely asked my father if we could pull over for a quick bathroom break. Madison sighed loudly and rolled her eyes, complaining that a 3-minute stop would completely ruin her perfectly planned arrival schedule. When I argued back, pointing out the absolute hypocrisy that my father had already pulled over 3 separate times just so she could get iced lattes and snacks, he lost his mind. He leaned over the center console and pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You need to learn a brutal lesson about respect," he screamed. "You do not talk back to your sister on her big day. Now get your garbage out of my sight." My mother, sitting in the passenger seat, did not even look up from her fashion magazine. She casually flipped a glossy page, completely unbothered that her youngest daughter was being discarded on the side of a dangerous highway. I stepped out onto the boiling gravel, honestly thinking it was just a sick bluff. I truly believed they would just drive a few feet and wait for me to run after them and apologize. They did not. The heavy car doors locked with a sharp click. The SUV accelerated hard, kicking up a massive cloud of hot dust into my lungs. I stood there completely frozen, watching their taillights disappear down the endless highway until there was nothing left but heat waves and silence. I had no cell phone. I had no wallet. I did not even have a bottle of water. They left me there to suffer. They thought I would break. They thought I would forever remain the helpless, invisible burden they always treated me as. They had no idea that the distinguished older man who found me walking alone on that dangerous shoulder hours later would eventually hand me the keys to his entire corporate empire. And they certainly had no idea that 15 years later, they would be standing in my executive boardroom, desperately begging me for entry-level warehouse jobs just to save their foreclosed home. Before I reveal exactly how that terrifying afternoon built an empire and the priceless look on my father's face when he realized exactly who was interviewing him, please take a quick second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly believe that karma never misses an address. Also, drop a comment right now and let me know what city you are listening from and what the local time is there. I love reading every single one of your comments. Now, let me take you back to that blazing August afternoon, to the exact moment the taillights vanished and the brutal reality of my toxic family finally set in. The first hour was nothing but the deafening roar of 18-wheelers blasting past me on Interstate 15. The sheer force of the wind from the massive semi-trucks nearly knocked me over every few minutes. I stood on the boiling gravel shoulder, squinting into the brutal heat waves, hoping to see my father's SUV reversing or making a U-turn. That was the delusion I had survived on for 16 years. The desperate, pathetic hope that my parents would suddenly remember they had 2 daughters. I told myself my father was just blowing off steam. I told myself my mother would eventually force him to turn around. But the sun continued to beat down on my unprotected shoulders, and the highway stretched out empty and indifferent. Realizing that standing on the shoulder of a major interstate was an absolute death sentence, I started walking toward a faded exit sign I could see a few miles ahead. My cheap canvas sneakers offered almost no protection against the blistering asphalt. With every painful step, my mind replayed my entire childhood. In the Evans household, my sister Madison was the primary investment, and I was simply the tax they had to pay. Madison was the golden child who could do absolutely no wrong. When she turned 16, my parents threw a massive catered party and surprised her with a brand new white Audi tied with a giant red bow. When I turned 16, my mother handed me a greeting card with a $20 bill inside and a new list of household chores. Madison received private SAT tutors and weekend trips to luxury spas. I received her worn-out hand-me-downs and the responsibility of cleaning the entire house while they went out to dinner without me. I clearly remembered the day I won first place in the state science fair. I had stood on the gymnasium stage holding my trophy, scanning the crowd for my parents. They never showed up. They had decided at the last minute to take Madison shopping for a designer dress for a college fraternity party. That was my permanent role in the family. Invisible, replaceable, a nuisance to be managed. It took me nearly 2 hours of walking to reach the highway exit. My lips were cracked and bleeding from the severe dehydration. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely keep myself upright. I stumbled off the highway ramp and found a dusty, isolated Sunoco gas station with a small, rundown diner attached to it. I dragged myself over to the large metal ice machine outside the convenience store doors and collapsed onto the concrete. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to make myself as small as possible. The brutal Nevada heat slowly began to break, giving way to a sudden creeping cold as the sun started to dip below the desert mountains. Long, terrifying shadows stretched across the cracked parking lot. A few cars pulled in to pump gas. I watched the drivers, hoping someone would notice a teenage girl sitting alone on the filthy ground. A woman in a minivan made direct eye contact with me, quickly locked her doors, and looked away. A man in a pickup truck stepped right over my outstretched legs to buy a pack of cigarettes without even acknowledging my existence. They looked right through me, just like my parents always did. The gas station attendant, a bored teenager wearing headphones, eventually locked the glass doors, turned off the open sign, and drove away, leaving me completely alone in the darkening lot. Panic finally clawed its way up my throat. The reality of my situation crushed the last remaining pieces of my childhood innocence. I was 16 years old, with no money, no identification, and no one in the world who cared if I lived or died. Just as the flickering neon lights of the gas station canopy buzzed to life, cutting through the desert dusk, a vehicle pulled off the highway. It was not a dusty pickup truck or a passing tourist. It was a sleek, immaculate black town car, the kind of luxury vehicle that looked entirely out of place in the gritty, desolate middle of nowhere. The car glided smoothly up to the premium gas pump. The engine purred with a quiet, expensive power before shutting off. The driver's side door opened and an older man stepped out. He had thick silver hair, perfectly styled, and he was wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my parents' vehicles combined. He moved with a quiet, commanding authority. I held my breath, pressing my back hard against the humming metal of the ice machine, hoping he would not notice me. In my experience, adults with power only used it to hurt the powerless. But as he reached for the fuel nozzle, he paused. His posture stiffened. He turned his head slowly, and his sharp blue eyes locked directly onto me, hiding in the shadows. He did not look away. He did not quickly lock his doors or pretend he did not see me. He gently placed the fuel nozzle back on the pump and began walking deliberately toward me. Every instinct I had developed from years of emotional abuse told me to run, but my legs were completely paralyzed by exhaustion and fear. The man stopped a few feet away, giving me plenty of space. He looked at my cheap, dirty clothes, my cracked lips, and my tear-stained face. His expression shifted rapidly from initial confusion to a profound, deep concern. He did not ask me where my parents were. He did not ask me what I had done wrong to end up on the street. He simply looked at me as a human being who was suffering. "Are you all right, young lady?" he asked. His voice was remarkably calm and steady, carrying a resonant warmth that I had never heard from a male figure in my entire life. I tried to speak, but my throat was so dry that only a pathetic, raspy sob came out. I violently shook my head no. The man immediately took out a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and offered it to me. He then turned his head toward the small diner across the road, which still had its neon lights buzzing. "You look like you need a safe place to sit and a hot meal," he said softly, but with absolute certainty. "My name is Harrison. I am not going to hurt you. I'm going to buy you some food, and then we are going to figure out how to fix this." I stared at the expensive silk handkerchief in his outstretched hand. My father would have yelled at me for crying in public. My mother would have told me to stop manipulating people with my tears. But Harrison just stood there, patiently, waiting for me to make the choice. I slowly reached out and took the handkerchief. It smelled like clean cedar and expensive cologne. With trembling legs, I forced myself to stand up. Harrison did not try to grab my arm or force me forward. He simply walked at a slow pace, ensuring I was right beside him as we crossed the empty 2-lane road toward the diner. The bell above the diner door chimed loudly as we walked in. The waitress behind the counter eyed my dirty clothes with immediate suspicion, but the moment she saw Harrison in his impeccable suit, her demeanor completely changed. She quickly led us to a quiet booth in the back corner. Harrison ordered me a large glass of water, a hot cup of tea, and a plate of warm food. He ordered nothing for himself. He just sat across from me, watching me with a calculated, protective intensity. As I drank the water, my survival instincts finally began to kick in. I realized that sitting across from a wealthy stranger in a remote diner was potentially dangerous, but I also knew that returning to my parents was a guaranteed toxic nightmare. For the first time in my life, I had to make a critical adult decision and trust someone. Between bites of food, the entire humiliating story began to spill out of my mouth. I told him about the argument in the car. I told him about the iced coffees and the bathroom break. I told him about the screeching tires and the crushing realization that my own father had thrown me away over a minor inconvenience. I even told him about the years of being the invisible workhorse in a house built entirely around my sister's fragile ego. I fully expected him to tell me that I must have done something to provoke them. I expected him to say that family is complicated and I should learn to be more forgiving. But Harrison listened in absolute dead silence. He did not interrupt me once. As I spoke, I watched his jaw tighten. I watched his hands fold together on the table, his knuckles turning totally white. A cold, terrifying fury flashed in his sharp blue eyes, but it was not directed at me. It was directed entirely at the people who had abandoned me. "No child deserves to be discarded," he said firmly, his voice vibrating with a quiet, dangerous anger. He slowly reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek mobile phone, placing it flat on the table between us. "I am calling the local police authorities right now," he stated. "We are going to force your parents to turn around and face exactly what they have done. And if they refuse, I will personally ensure they are hunted down for felony child abandonment." My heart slammed against my ribs. The conflict was no longer just about me surviving the harsh desert. It was about to become a full-blown legal confrontation, and my deeply toxic parents had absolutely no idea what kind of powerful man was waiting for them. Harrison did not hesitate for a single second. He pressed his sleek mobile phone to his ear and spoke to the emergency dispatcher with a calm but absolute authority that demanded immediate attention. He did not sound frantic. He sounded like a man who was entirely used to giving orders and having them followed without question. He clearly stated our exact location at the isolated Sunoco gas station on Interstate 15 and informed the dispatcher that he was currently sitting with an abandoned female minor who was in severe distress. He then calmly requested that law enforcement be dispatched immediately to handle a case of felony child endangerment. Hearing him say those words out loud sent a massive shockwave straight through my chest. Felony child endangerment. Up until that exact moment, I had spent my entire 16 years of life believing that the way my parents treated me was completely normal. I thought that being the invisible punching bag of the family was just my natural role. I thought that being punished with extreme cruelty for speaking out of turn was simply how strict parenting worked. But hearing a wealthy, successful stranger cleanly categorize my parents' actions as a literal major crime shattered the deep psychological illusion I had been living under. Within 20 minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of 2 Nevada State Police cruisers cut fiercely through the pitch-black desert night. They pulled into the diner parking lot with a heavy sense of urgency. 2 uniformed officers wearing heavy-duty belts and stern expressions walked through the diner doors. The bells jingled sharply, announcing their arrival. The late-night waitress, who had been watching us from behind the counter, immediately pointed them toward our corner booth. The taller officer, a man with a weathered face and sharp eyes, approached us and asked me to state my name and age. I was shaking so violently that I could barely get the words out. Harrison placed a steady, reassuring hand on the table and gently encouraged me to tell the officers exactly what I had told him. I recounted the entire humiliating ordeal. I explained the argument over the bathroom break. I described the screeching tires and the terrifying moment the locks clicked shut. I told them how my father had screamed at me to get out of the vehicle, and how my mother had simply turned the page of her magazine while I was discarded on the side of a blazing hot highway. The 2 police officers exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. They were highway patrolmen. They knew exactly how dangerous the Nevada desert was in the middle of August. They knew that a 16-year-old girl, left alone on that specific stretch of interstate, was a prime target for human trafficking or heat stroke. The taller officer pulled out his notepad and asked for my parents' cell phone numbers. At that exact moment, my parents were completely oblivious to the legal firestorm heading their way. They were approximately 3 hours away, having already crossed the state line into California. They were busy pulling into the parking lot of Madison's incredibly expensive private college. I could vividly picture the scene in my head. They were probably unloading her brand new matching luggage sets and carrying boxes of designer dorm room decorations. Madison was probably complaining about the humidity, while my mother fussed over her hair and my father proudly carried her heavy bags. They had completely written me off. They assumed I was still sitting in the dirt crying and learning my lesson, just waiting for them to casually swing back around the next day to retrieve me like a forgotten umbrella. The police officer dialed my father's number and put the call on speakerphone, placing it on the diner table so Harrison and I could hear. The phone rang 4 times before my father finally answered. His voice was bright and cheerful, completely free of any guilt or concern. He answered with a breezy hello, assuming it was a colleague or a friend calling to congratulate him on dropping his golden child at college. "This is Officer Davis with the Nevada State Police," the officer said, his voice hard and flat. "Am I speaking with Thomas Evans?" The cheerful tone instantly vanished from my father's voice, replaced by a sudden, nervous hesitation. "Yes, this is Thomas. Is there a problem, officer?" The officer leaned over the table. "We currently have your 16-year-old daughter, Harper, in our protective custody at a diner off Interstate 15. She informed us that you forcibly removed her from your vehicle and abandoned her on the shoulder of the highway over 3 hours ago." There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. Then my father did exactly what he always did. He lied and he minimized. "Oh, officer, this is just a massive misunderstanding," my father chuckled nervously, trying to sound like a reasonable, exhausted parent dealing with a rebellious teenager. "We were just teaching her a little lesson about respect. We drove down to the next exit to turn around and come right back for her, but we got turned around. We are actually heading back to get her right now." It was a blatant, pathetic lie. They were 3 hours in the opposite direction. "Cut the nonsense," Thomas, the officer, snapped, completely dropping any pretense of politeness. We ran your license plate through the highway toll cameras. We know exactly where you are. And we know you have been driving west toward California for the last 3 hours without stopping. You did not turn around. You abandoned a minor in a dangerous environment. I heard my mother shriek faintly in the background on the other end of the line. The panic was finally setting in. Here is what is going to happen right now, Thomas the officer continued, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet diner. You are going to turn your vehicle around this exact second. You are going to drive the 3 hours back to this specific location. If you are not walking through the doors of this diner by 2 a.m, I am personally filing felony child abandonment charges and issuing a warrant for your immediate arrest. Do you understand me? Yes, sir, my father whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and suppressed rage. We are on our way. The officer hung up the phone. The wait began. It was a grueling, suffocating 3-hour wait. The diner slowly emptied out until it was just me, Harrison, and the police officers, who periodically checked in from their cruisers outside. I fully expected Harrison to leave. He was a wealthy man in an expensive suit. He had done his good deed for the year by buying me dinner and calling the cops. He had every reason to get back into his luxury town car and continue his journey. But he absolutely refused to leave my side. During those 3 hours, Harrison and I talked, or rather, he talked and I listened, absorbing every single word like a starving person given bread. He asked me about my grades and my interests. I told him about my science fair projects and my ability to organize complex data systems. I told him how I essentially managed the entire household budget because my parents were too busy spending money on my sister to balance their own checkbook. Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You are incredibly intelligent, Harper, he said softly. Your family does not value you because they are entirely focused on appearances. They invest in your sister because she fits their shallow narrative of success. But true success is not inherited, and it is certainly not bought with a shiny new car. True success is built in the dark, when no one is watching. You have a brilliant analytical mind. Do not ever let small-minded people convince you that you are worthless just because they are too blind to see your potential. Those words fundamentally altered my entire brain chemistry. For my entire life, I had been told I was a burden. And here was a highly successful man telling me I was brilliant. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, thick business card with gold-embossed lettering. He slid it across the table toward me. Keep this hidden, he instructed, his tone shifting to pure business. When you are 18 years old and legally free from their control, you call that private number. I will help you build a life they could never even dream of. I took the card with trembling fingers and buried it deep inside my shoe. It felt like holding a secret weapon. At exactly 2 a.m, the familiar headlights of my father's heavy SUV pierced the darkness of the diner parking lot. The vehicle lurched into a parking space, and the driver's side door flew open. My father marched toward the diner doors with heavy, aggressive footsteps. Through the glass window, I could see my mother sitting in the passenger seat, with her arms crossed, looking incredibly annoyed that her perfect evening in California had been ruined by my dramatic existence. The diner bells violently jingled as my father stormed inside. He looked exhausted, sweaty, and absolutely furious. He did not rush over to check if I was injured. He did not pull me into a tight hug and apologize for losing his temper. He marched straight over to the booth, his face twisted into a snarl of pure narcissistic rage. You just could not wait, could you? He hissed at me, his voice shaking with anger as he completely ignored the police officers standing by the door. You had to go and involve the cops and completely embarrass us. Madison is sitting in an empty dorm room right now because of your selfish little stunt. Get up right now. We are leaving. I shrank back into the vinyl booth, terrified by his aggressive posture. But before my father could reach out and grab my arm, Harrison smoothly stood up. Harrison was a tall man, but his presence made him seem like a towering giant. He stepped deliberately between me and my father, entirely blocking his path. The physical difference between the two men was staggering. My father was a middle-management suburban bully sweating in a wrinkled polo shirt. Harrison was a pillar of quiet, lethal corporate authority. "You will not speak to her in that tone," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, icy register. My father puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his dominance. "Who the hell are you? This is family business. Step aside, old man." Harrison did not move a single inch. "If she were my daughter," Harrison said, his voice cutting through the diner like a sharpened blade, "I would move mountains for her. I would burn the world down to keep her safe." "You left her in the desert to be hunted. You are a weak, pathetic excuse for a man." My father balled his hands into fists. "You have no right to interfere with my family." "I have every right," Harrison replied, stepping 1 inch closer, forcing my father to instinctively take a step back. "Because I am the only reason you are not currently wearing handcuffs. Count your blessings that the police called you instead of Child Protective Services. Because if I make one single phone call right now, I can guarantee that by sunrise, your golden child daughter will be pulled out of her expensive college and your entire life will be tied up in federal child endangerment hearings. Do you want to test my resources, Thomas?" My father swallowed hard. The aggressive fire in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard realization that he was completely outmatched. He looked at Harrison's expensive suit, his calm, lethal demeanor, and the police officers watching the exchange with their hands resting on their utility belts. My father realized he could not bully his way out of this. "Get in the car, Harper," my father muttered, his voice defeated and humiliatingly quiet. I stood up, clutching my cheap jacket. I looked at Harrison one last time. He gave me a single, subtle nod of encouragement. I walked past my father and out into the cold desert night, climbing into the back seat of the silent, suffocating SUV. The drive home was completely silent, but the brutal punishment that was waiting for me would last for the next 2 years. However, the entire power dynamic had permanently shifted. I was no longer a crying child hoping for their love. I was a strategist with an exit plan and a golden ticket hidden inside my shoe. The 3-hour drive back to our suburban home was a suffocating vacuum of absolute silence. The tension inside the vehicle was so incredibly thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. My father gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were stark white, illuminated only by the harsh green glow of the dashboard lights. My mother stared blankly out the passenger window, deliberately ignoring my terrified reflection in the rearview mirror. They were not silent out of parental guilt or remorse. They were silent because they were absolutely seething with a toxic and deeply irrational resentment. In their twisted reality, I had not just survived a traumatic abandonment in the middle of a blazing desert. In their minds, I had maliciously orchestrated a massive public humiliation that forced them to drive 6 extra hours and deal with aggressive law enforcement officers who threatened to arrest them. The moment we finally pulled into our driveway, the new regime was immediately enforced. For the remaining 2 years of my high school education, I was effectively placed under strict house arrest. My parents systematically stripped away every single one of my after-school clubs and extracurricular activities. I was strictly forbidden from getting a part-time job because my father claimed I was too unstable and could not be trusted in the real world. My entire existence was brutally reduced to going to high school and coming straight home to scrub hardwood floors, do piles of laundry, and quietly maintain the pristine outward image of the Evans household. They even went out of their way to tell our extended family members that I was going through a highly troubled, rebellious phase to justify keeping me completely isolated. Whenever the emotional tension in the house boiled over, my mother would smoothly deploy her absolute favorite weapon, which was weaponized gaslighting. "You have always been so incredibly dramatic, Harper," she would sigh while pouring herself a generous glass of expensive red wine in the kitchen. We just pulled the car over to check the tire pressure, and you completely overreacted by running off. You owe your father a massive apology for involving those unhinged police officers and ruining your sister's big move-in day. Before that terrifying night in the Nevada desert, that specific kind of relentless psychological manipulation would have completely broken my spirit. I would have internalized the intense blame and desperately tried to earn their elusive forgiveness by being the perfect, obedient daughter. But Harrison had handed me something far more valuable than a hot meal and a police intervention. He had handed me a profound and unbreakable sense of self-worth. The entire power dynamic in our house had fundamentally and permanently shifted. I was no longer a desperate child hoping for tiny scraps of parental affection. I was a highly tactical strategist, trapped behind enemy lines, actively planning my permanent exit. I had taken the crisp business card Harrison gave me and hidden it inside a tiny slit I carefully cut into the bottom fabric of my bedroom mattress. Every single night, when the house went completely dark and silent, I would slip my fingers into the torn fabric just to feel the thick, high-quality cardstock. The embossed gold lettering was a tangible, physical promise that a much better world existed outside the suffocating walls of my parents' suburban prison. I just had to survive long enough to reach it. Meanwhile, my parents continued to blindly pour their entire financial existence into Madison. She called home constantly, complaining loudly about how difficult her elite California college was. Instead of telling her to study harder or go to the library, my parents frantically threw money at the problem to soothe her anxiety. They paid for luxury off-campus housing because she claimed the dormitory walls were too thin. They paid for premium gourmet meal delivery services because she insisted the campus dining hall food gave her stomach issues. They were heavily bleeding cash to support a total fantasy, while I was quietly auditing their careless credit card statements that they foolishly left lying around the kitchen island. The morning of my 18th birthday arrived without a single greeting or celebration. My parents had conveniently flown to California the day before to comfort Madison through her midterm exams, leaving me completely alone in the house. It was the absolute perfect window of opportunity. I did not pack any of the cheap clothes they had bought me. I did not take any items of sentimental value, because honestly, there were none to take. I packed a single, worn-out duffel bag with my basic necessities, my birth certificate, my Social Security card, and the crisp business card. I walked out the front door, locked the deadbolt behind me, and dropped my house key directly into the storm drain on the corner of the street. Hearing the metal key splash into the dark water below was the most liberating sound I had ever heard. I never looked back. The next 4 years were a grueling, relentless grind of pure survival. I rented a tiny, damp room in a shared apartment complex near a public state university. To pay for my tuition and basic groceries, I worked punishing double shifts at a greasy local diner near the campus. It was grueling, exhausting physical labor, but every single time I wiped down a sticky table or dealt with a rude, demanding customer, I was instantly reminded of the diner in the desert where my entire life changed. I used that powerful memory as pure, high-octane fuel. I smelled like stale coffee and frying oil for 4 solid years, but I maintained a perfect 4.0 grade point average. I immersed myself entirely in business management and complex tech logistics. I learned how to build efficient systems, how to identify critical inefficiencies, and how to execute high-level corporate strategies that most students could not even comprehend. While I was building my solid foundation, brick by painful brick, my sister was incredibly busy dismantling hers. Through the occasional unsolicited text message from a gossiping cousin, I learned the disastrous downward trajectory of the golden child. Madison dropped out of her prestigious California university during her junior year, claiming the rigorous academic environment was simply too toxic for her creative spirit. Instead of cutting her off or demanding accountability, my parents welcomed her back home with open arms and completely open wallets. Shortly after dropping out, Madison met and abruptly married a man named Bradley. Bradley was exactly the kind of man my entitled sister deserved. He was a fast-talking, arrogant opportunist who constantly bragged about being a visionary entrepreneur, but had absolutely nothing tangible to show for it. He bounced from one catastrophic startup to another, attempting to launch terrible applications and flawed delivery services, burning through investors' cash with alarming speed. And who were his primary gullible investors? My parents. They were quietly draining their retirement accounts and taking out massive secondary home equity loans to fund Bradley's ridiculous delusions, simply to keep Madison living in the extreme luxury she felt entitled to. The massive financial ruin was entirely inevitable, but I was too busy succeeding to care. I did not have the time or the emotional energy to care about their impending collapse because I was standing on the precipice of my own brilliant future. My college graduation day was a cool, bright afternoon in May. The university stadium was packed to the brim with thousands of proud parents, cheering, screaming, and holding up massive, colorful signs for their children. When my name was called over the loud stadium speakers, there was absolutely no one in the stands cheering for me. The silence from my family was absolute and complete. But as I walked across that large stage and grasped my hard-earned diploma, I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow or rejection. I felt completely invincible. I walked straight out of the crowded stadium, completely bypassed the loud celebratory campus parties, and sat down alone on a quiet park bench overlooking the city. I reached into my bag and pulled out the business card I had fiercely protected for 6 entire years. The gold lettering caught the bright afternoon sun. With a steady hand and a racing heart, I typed the numbers into my cell phone and finally dialed Harrison's private line. He answered on the very first ring, setting the exact stage for an explosive corporate ascent that would eventually bring my toxic family crawling right to my feet. Harper Harrison, said his voice, deep, warm, and immediately recognizable. I have been waiting for this exact call for 6 years. He did not ask me how my graduation ceremony went or make polite small talk. He did not ask me to send over a resume or arrange a casual coffee meeting. He simply gave me an address in the financial district of downtown Seattle and told me to be in the main lobby at 8 o'clock sharp the following morning. I spent the entire night ironing my only cheap clearance rack business suit and polishing my scuffed shoes. When I arrived at the address the next morning, I found myself standing on the sidewalk, staring up at a massive 70-story skyscraper made of gleaming glass and dark steel. The words Vanguard Innovations were elegantly etched into the massive marble wall behind the reception desk. I had spent the last 4 years deeply immersed in studying tech logistics, so I knew exactly what Vanguard was. They were not just a successful company. They were a towering industry titan that managed the supply chain software for half of the Western Hemisphere. And the man who had bought me a plate of cheap diner food and protected me from my aggressive father was the founder and sole owner. When the executive elevator doors opened on the top floor, Harrison was standing there waiting for me. He looked older, his silver hair a bit thinner, but his posture was just as commanding, and his sharp blue eyes were just as intensely focused. He walked me into his expansive corner office, overlooking the entire city skyline, and motioned for me to sit down. "I am not going to give you a corner office or a fancy executive title, Harper," he said plainly, sitting across from me. "Handouts create weak leaders, and I do not build weak leaders. I'm going to offer you a position in the Basement Data Processing Center. You will be logging shipping manifests for 12 hours a day. It is grueling, tedious, and entirely unglamorous. But if you are half as brilliant as I suspect you are, you will not stay in the basement for long. Do you want the job?" I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I will start right now." That was the beginning of the most intense and rewarding decade of my entire life. I did not just work for Vanguard. I practically lived inside the building. I spent my first 2 years in that windowless basement doing exactly what Harrison promised. I logged endless lines of supply chain data until my vision blurred. But I did not just enter the data blindly. I analyzed it. I found massive systemic inefficiencies in the way the company routed international freight. This led to my first major corporate conflict. I drafted a comprehensive 60-page proposal to restructure the entire routing algorithm and handed it to my direct supervisor, a bitter mid-level manager named Richard. Richard took one look at my cheap suit and my young age and threw the proposal into his desk drawer, telling me to stick to data entry. A week later, I found out he had taken my exact proposal, removed my name, put his own name on the cover, and submitted it to the executive board for a massive promotion. The old Harper, the terrified 16-year-old girl who used to shrink away from my father's screaming, would have stayed silent and let Richard steal my work. But Harrison had taught me that silence was just another word for surrender. I did not cry, and I did not complain to HR. I simply waited until the morning Richard was scheduled to present the stolen algorithm to the executive board. I bypassed the security protocols, walked directly into the executive boardroom, and locked the heavy oak doors behind me. Richard turned pale as a ghost. I ignored him completely and walked straight up to the head of the table where Harrison and the senior vice presidents were sitting. I calmly pulled out the original raw data logs featuring the timestamps and complex coding sequences that only I had the access passwords to. I systematically dismantled Richard's stolen presentation in less than 5 minutes, exposing him as a complete fraud who did not even understand the basic mathematics behind the algorithm he was claiming as his own. Richard was fired before lunch. Harrison promoted me to junior analyst that same afternoon. From that moment forward, my ascent was absolute. Harrison became the fiercely protective father figure I had always desperately craved but never actually had. The stark contrast between him and my biological father was almost difficult to process. Thomas Evans had spent his entire life trying to make me feel incredibly small so that he could feel big. Harrison Caldwell spent his time constantly pushing me to be colossal. When I made a mistake, Harrison did not scream at me or abandon me. He sat me down, forced me to analyze the failure, and taught me how to weaponize that failure for the next battle. By the time I was 28 years old, I had clawed my way up to Vice President of Global Operations. My defining moment came during a vicious bidding war for a massive European shipping contract that would effectively double our annual revenue. We were losing the bid to a ruthless rival tech firm that was heavily undercutting our prices. The Vanguard executive board was completely panicked, ready to concede defeat. I refused to back down. I flew directly to Berlin, uninvited, and demanded a 10-minute meeting with the European shipping executives. I did not give them a standard polished sales pitch. Instead, I handed them a detailed predictive analysis proving that our rivals' cheaper software had a fatal security flaw that would inevitably crash their entire shipping grid during the peak holiday season, costing them billions. I backed it up with undeniable hard data. I walked out of that room with a signed, exclusive 10-year contract. When I returned to Seattle, the entire Vanguard building gave me a standing ovation. But the victory was incredibly short-lived because the ultimate conflict was looming just around the corner. Harrison's health began to rapidly decline shortly after my 29th birthday. A brutal, aggressive illness started stripping away his physical strength. The corporate vultures immediately began circling. A faction of wealthy board members saw his illness as the perfect opportunity to seize control of the company. They wanted to sell Vanguard to a massive conglomerate and liquidate our assets for a quick multi-billion-dollar payout. And their very first order of business was to completely eliminate me, because they knew I was fiercely loyal to Harrison's original vision. They called a hostile emergency board meeting while Harrison was in the hospital receiving treatments. The lead investor, an arrogant billionaire named Sterling, sat at the head of the table and slid a severance package toward me. He looked at me with the exact same dismissive arrogance my mother used to have. "You have done a cute job playing executive," Harper Sterling sneered, "but the adults need to take over now. Take the multi-million-dollar severance and walk away quietly before we publicly terminate you and ruin your reputation." I did not even look at the severance package. I just stared at Sterling and smiled a cold, calculated smile. "You think you are staging a corporate coup, Sterling?" I said softly. "But you failed to read the corporate bylaws that Harrison and I rewrote 3 years ago." Right on cue, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. Harrison walked in. He looked incredibly frail, and he was using a cane to support his weight, but his sharp blue eyes were just as lethal as the night he stood down my father in that desert diner. The entire boardroom fell dead silent. Harrison walked slowly to the head of the table, forcing Sterling to awkwardly vacate the chair. Harrison did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed a signed, legally binding corporate succession document on the polished wood. "I am stepping down, effectively immediately," Harrison announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "And I am transferring my absolute majority voting shares directly to Harper. She is not taking a severance package. She is taking my chair. She is the new Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Innovations. If any of you have a problem with taking orders from her, you can leave your security badges on the table and exit my building." Not a single man in that room moved a muscle. They were completely defeated. Harrison passed away peacefully 6 months later. It was the most profound loss of my life, but I did not fall apart because he had trained me to be made of iron. At 31 years old, I was sitting at the helm of a sprawling global tech empire. I had a stunning penthouse overlooking the ocean, custom-tailored suits, and a life built entirely on my own relentless merit. I had successfully severed every single emotional tie to my deeply toxic past. I had completely forgotten about the people who left me on the side of that highway. They were nothing but ghosts from a previous lifetime. I was untouchable. Until a Tuesday morning in late October. Vanguard had just launched a massive new fulfillment and logistics warehouse facility in my old home state to handle our rapidly expanding Western operations. It was a highly publicized, multi-million-dollar local investment that promised hundreds of excellent-paying jobs with premium healthcare benefits. I was sitting at my mahogany desk reviewing the quarterly profit margins when my director of human resources, Sarah, knocked on my door. Sarah was a seasoned professional who rarely interrupted my deep work sessions unless it was an absolute emergency. She walked into my office holding 3 manila folders. She looked highly uncomfortable. "Ms. Harper," Sarah said hesitantly, placing the folders on my desk, "I personally review all the flagged applications for the new Western facility. We had an incredibly strange anomaly in the system this morning. 3 separate candidates from the exact same residential address applied for positions ranging from entry-level warehouse packing to a mid-level shift supervisor role. Our background check software flagged them because their financial histories indicate extreme, severe debt and impending bankruptcy. Normally, I would just reject them outright due to their highly fabricated resumes, but their last names triggered a secondary alert in your personal security profile." I frowned, picking up the first folder. I flipped it open, and the breath was instantly, violently knocked out of my lungs. Staring back at me were the names Thomas Evans, Susan Evans, and Bradley Miller. My father, my mother, and my golden sister's arrogant failure of a husband. The people who had abandoned me to the wolves were now desperately knocking on the door of my house, begging for scraps. And they had absolutely no idea who was waiting for them on the other side. I stared at the 3 manila folders on my massive mahogany desk for what felt like an absolute eternity. The names printed on the crisp white applicant labels seemed to mock me. Thomas Evans, Susan Evans, Bradley Miller. The sheer statistical impossibility of this exact moment was staggering. Out of all the massive logistics companies in the entire country, out of all the regional fulfillment centers opening in their state, they had blindly applied to Vanguard Innovations. They had absolutely no idea that the faceless corporate entity they were currently begging for employment was the exact same 16-year-old girl they had thrown away like garbage 15 years ago. Since taking over as chief executive officer, I had deliberately kept my public profile incredibly low-key. I rarely gave media interviews, and on official corporate documents, I used my first name and a married surname I had briefly held during a short-lived marriage in my late 20s. To my parents, the CEO of Vanguard was just another wealthy, untouchable corporate billionaire. They had no idea they were walking straight into my absolute domain. I knew exactly why they were suddenly applying for these specific hourly wage jobs. Through the occasional text message from a mutual cousin, I had kept quiet tabs on their massive financial downfall. My father had been laid off from his comfortable middle management job several years ago and could not find equivalent work. Meanwhile, they had burned through their entire retirement savings trying to fund Bradley's ridiculous startup companies just to keep Madison living in the extreme luxury she fiercely felt entitled to. The money had finally run out. Bradley's last venture had completely collapsed, leaving them drowning in crippling debt. Madison had lost her expensive home to foreclosure and was forced to move her husband and their 2 children back into my parents' cramped suburban house. They were completely desperate. This warehouse facility was their absolute last chance to avoid total bankruptcy. I opened the first folder, which belonged to Bradley. The man who had single-handedly bankrupted my parents was now applying for a mid-level shift supervisor position. Reading his resume was a masterclass in absolute fiction. Under his employment history, he had boldly listed himself as the chief executive officer of multiple independent tech startups. He used elaborate corporate buzzwords like disruptive market synergy and visionary growth optimization to describe what were essentially catastrophic financial failures. He did not mention that his disruptive synergy had resulted in massive secondary mortgages and ruined credit scores. He claimed to be a highly effective leader who thrived in fast-paced environments, but I knew he was just an arrogant opportunist who had drained my parents dry to fund his delusions. Now he wanted to drain Vanguard for a steady paycheck and premium health insurance. I tossed Bradley's folder aside and opened the next one. My father, Thomas Evans. He was applying for a standard warehouse packing and logistics tracking role. Seeing his employment history laid out on paper was almost pathetic. He had heavily inflated his past middle management roles, claiming he had spearheaded major corporate restructuring initiatives. In reality, he was a mid-level paper pusher who had been casually laid off during a routine downsizing because he was entirely replaceable. But the absolute most infuriating line on his entire resume was under his core competencies. He had actually typed the words, "highly dependable leader who remains calm and fiercely protective under extreme pressure." I read that sentence 3 times. My hands started to shake with a sudden, intense anger. The man who claimed to be a dependable protector under extreme pressure was the exact same man who had screamed at his teenage daughter until his face turned purple and abandoned her on the side of a scorching Nevada highway simply because she asked to use the restroom. The sheer level of self-deception required to type those words was breathtaking. He actually believed he was a good, honorable man. But nothing could have prepared me for the final folder. My mother, Susan, had applied for an administrative desk position within the warehouse office. Unlike the other 2, she had attached a highly detailed 2-page cover letter. I began reading it, and I actually had to force myself to stop and laugh out loud in the dead silence of my office. My mother had written an entire essay entirely centered around her unwavering dedication to family values. She passionately described her decades of experience managing a complex household and nurturing the successful growth of her children. She claimed that her greatest strength was her deep well of empathy and her ability to create a highly supportive environment for everyone around her. She wrote that she wanted to bring her maternal warmth and fierce loyalty to the Vanguard corporate family. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. Maternal warmth, fierce loyalty. This was the exact same woman who had coldly turned the page of her glossy fashion magazine while her youngest daughter was being thrown out of a moving vehicle into a hostile desert. This was the woman who had locked me in the house for 2 solid years, stripping away my entire high school experience simply because my survival had deeply inconvenienced her. She had spent her entire life shielding her golden child daughter from the slightest bit of discomfort, while actively participating in my psychological destruction. And now she was trying to leverage those non-existent family values to secure a corporate desk job to save her house. I picked up all 3 folders and held them directly over the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting next to my mahogany desk. It would have been incredibly easy. I could just let the machine pull the documents in, turning their desperate lies into tiny strips of meaningless confetti. I could instruct Sarah, my human resources director, to send them standard automated rejection emails. They would never know. They would just assume they were unqualified, and they would continue to drown in the massive financial ruin they had blindly brought upon themselves. It would be a quiet, sterile, and entirely corporate revenge. But as I held the folders over the shredder, I looked at the framed photograph of Harrison sitting on my credenza. Harrison had not saved me by being quiet or passive. He had confronted my father directly, forcing him to look his absolute failure right in the eyes. Harrison did not build weak leaders, and he did not shy away from necessary confrontation. If I just shredded their resumes, I would be hiding. I would still be acting like the terrified 16-year-old girl hiding behind the ice machine at the Sunoco gas station. I was no longer that girl. I was Harper, the chief executive officer of a global tech empire. I did not do easy. I did highly impactful. I placed the folders back on the polished mahogany desk. I pressed the intercom button. "Sarah," I said, keeping my voice entirely smooth and professional, "please fast-track these 3 specific candidates for in-person interviews this coming Friday morning. Book the main executive boardroom on the top floor." There was a brief pause on the other end of the intercom. "Ms. Harper?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with obvious confusion. "You want to conduct entry-level warehouse interviews yourself, down at the local facility?" "No," I replied. "I want you to fly them here to the corporate headquarters in Seattle. Book their commercial flights and put them in a standard business hotel. Tell them they have been selected for an elite fast-track management program, and the CEO wishes to evaluate them personally. They will have absolutely no idea what is actually happening until they walk through those boardroom doors." Sarah agreed immediately, recognizing the tone of absolute authority in my voice. As I disconnected the intercom, I looked back down at the names on the folders. For 15 years, my family had operated under the delusion that they held all the power. They thought they had permanently discarded a heavy burden. They were about to fly hundreds of miles, completely unaware that they were walking straight into a meticulously designed corporate trap. And the sheer panic that was going to cross their faces when they finally looked across the boardroom table and saw exactly who held their survival in her hands was going to be absolutely priceless. Sarah stood in my office completely stunned by my exact instructions. I had just calmly told my human resources director to completely bypass our standard local interview protocols and immediately book 3 commercial flights from their regional airport directly to our corporate headquarters in Seattle. I explicitly instructed her to put them up in a standard business hotel downtown and to send them a highly formal encrypted email stating that due to their unique combined experience, Vanguard Innovations had selected them for an elite fast-track management evaluation. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, her professional composure slightly cracking, because chief executive officers simply do not personally interview applicants for warehouse shift supervisor positions. But she was a consummate professional who knew better than to question a direct executive order. She nodded sharply, gathered the 3 manila folders from my mahogany desk, and walked out to execute my precise instructions. I knew exactly what was going to happen in their cramped, chaotic suburban house the absolute second that official corporate email hit their inboxes. I could vividly picture the scene playing out in my mind. My mother would probably cry dramatic tears of joy, deeply believing that the universe was finally rewarding her for her entirely self-proclaimed dedication to family values. My father would immediately puff up his chest proudly, declaring to anyone who would listen that a massive global tech conglomerate had finally recognized his brilliant, untapped managerial potential. And Bradley, the arrogant serial failure who had married my golden child sister, would undoubtedly convince himself that his heavily fabricated resume had successfully fooled the entire Vanguard corporate hierarchy. They were going to spend the next 48 hours practically floating on air. They were going to pack their cheap bags and fly hundreds of miles, completely unaware that the golden ticket they thought they had just miraculously won was actually a meticulously designed psychological trap. I wanted them completely out of their element. If I interviewed them at the local regional warehouse facility, they would still feel a false sense of geographical security. I wanted them stripped of their familiar suburban surroundings and placed directly into the terrifying, intimidating heart of my corporate machine. I wanted them to feel the sheer crushing magnitude of the empire I had built before they even realized who actually sat on the throne. Over the next 2 days, while they were frantically packing their best budget business attire, I ordered a deep dive corporate financial background check on all 3 of them. It was a standard operating procedure for any individual entering the executive floors of our headquarters. But the highly detailed financial reports that landed on my desk on Thursday afternoon were incredibly grim. As a child, I vividly remembered my father ruling our household finances with an absolute iron fist. He used to sit at the kitchen table with a calculator, loudly complaining about the minor cost of my cheap public school supplies, while simultaneously writing massive checks to fund my sister's designer clothing habits. He always portrayed himself as a brilliant, undisputed financial provider who knew exactly how the world worked. The man staring back at me from these official background checks was a total financial disaster. He was currently carrying 3 separate maxed-out credit cards and a predatory secondary mortgage with an astronomical interest rate. My mother had absolutely 0 personal savings, and the background check indicated she had recently pawned several pieces of expensive jewelry that my father had bought her during his supposedly successful years. But Bradley's financial file was the absolute worst of all. He was drowning in a massive mountain of defaulted business loans and was currently facing pending civil litigation from several angry former investors who had finally realized his disruptive tech startups were nothing but a complete sham. My sister Madison had demanded a life of extreme luxury, and instead of telling her to get a job, my parents and Bradley had literally bankrupted themselves, trying to maintain her fragile golden child illusion. The bank had already initiated the final foreclosure process on my parents' suburban home. The official eviction notice was scheduled to be served in exactly 14 days. This was not just a casual job interview for them. This was their absolute final lifeline. If they did not secure these high-paying corporate positions, they were going to be completely homeless and utterly ruined by the end of the month. Knowing the absolute severe desperation of their situation did not make me feel a single ounce of guilt. It actually hardened my resolve to absolute diamond. For 15 years, I had carried the heavy, crushing weight of their rejection. I had spent countless nights in my early 20s sitting in a damp, rented room, wondering why I was so fundamentally unlovable that my own biological parents would rather abandon me in a hostile, scorching desert than simply act like decent human beings. But looking at their disastrous financial reality laid out in black and white, I finally understood the fundamental truth. They were not powerful, authoritative figures. They were deeply incompetent, shallow people who had simply projected their own massive insecurities onto the easiest available target. I had been the designated convenient scapegoat for their miserable lives. Now the tables were completely and permanently turned. Friday morning arrived with a crisp electric energy that violently buzzed beneath my skin. I did not dress in my usual understated corporate attire. I deliberately chose a razor-sharp, tailored navy blue power suit that commanded absolute visual authority. The fabric was immaculate, the cut was severe, and it projected an aura of complete, unyielding control. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight style that left my facial features completely exposed. I wanted them to see every single angle of my face the absolute second they walked into that room. I fastened the heavy vintage Rolex that Harrison had gifted me on the day I made Chief Executive Officer around my left wrist. The cold, heavy metal resting against my pulse was a physical, tangible reminder of the massive empire I had built and the incredible, fiercely protective man who had taught me exactly how to govern it. Harrison had always told me that true power does not need to shout. It simply needs to occupy the physical space completely. I arrived at the Vanguard headquarters 2 full hours before the scheduled 10 o'clock interview. I walked directly into the main executive boardroom on the top floor to personally arrange the battlefield. The room was already highly intimidating by its very nature. It featured a massive, polished oak table, a towering ceiling, and floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a dizzying, sweeping panoramic view of the entire Seattle skyline. The morning fog was just beginning to burn off the distant mountains, casting a cold, crisp blue light across the entire corporate suite. I explicitly instructed the facilities management team to remove all the extra leather chairs from the room. I placed exactly one heavy, high-backed leather executive chair at the absolute head of the table. Then I placed 3 standard guest chairs directly opposite my seat, pushed closely together. I wanted the physical space to visually communicate the exact, brutal power dynamic that was about to unfold. They were going to sit clustered together on one side of a vast, empty table, looking directly into the glaring morning sunlight, while I sat comfortably in the cool shadows at the absolute head of the empire. At exactly 9:45, my desktop monitor pinged with a secure alert from the ground floor security desk. I pulled up the live, high-definition closed-circuit camera feed and watched closely as Thomas, Susan, and Bradley walked through the massive revolving glass doors of my building. Watching them navigate the lobby was an incredibly surreal experience. My father was wearing a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit that looked at least 10 years out of date. He kept trying to smooth down his wrinkled lapels. He was constantly craning his neck, looking up at the towering marble walls and the massive digital stock tickers running across the lobby, with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe and deep intimidation. He looked exactly like a desperate man preparing to beg for his life, which in financial terms, he absolutely was. My mother was nervously clutching her faux leather purse, practically hiding behind his shoulder. She looked significantly older, tired, and completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the corporate wealth surrounding her. She kept looking at the polished floors and the armed security guards with wide, terrified eyes. Bradley, on the other hand, was strutting through the lobby like he already owned the entire building. He was wearing a flashy, patterned tie and speaking loudly to the security personnel, projecting a completely fake, arrogant confidence designed entirely to mask his obvious internal panic. They officially checked in at the front reception desk and were handed temporary corporate visitor badges. The security guard directed them to the private executive elevator bank, which required a specialized encrypted key card to access. I watched the camera feed intently as the heavy, brushed steel doors closed securely behind them, locking them inside the elevator car as it began its rapid 70-story ascent to the executive floor. My heart started to beat in a slow, steady, incredibly powerful rhythm. This was the exact, precise moment I had been subconsciously preparing for since the day I walked away from their toxic house with nothing but a single duffel bag and a hidden business card tucked inside my shoe. I closed the security camera feed on my monitor and walked down the quiet, thickly carpeted hallway toward the executive boardroom. I stepped inside, leaving the heavy oak doors slightly cracked open. I took my designated seat at the head of the polished table, resting my hands flat against the cold, smooth wood. I took a deep, steadying breath, inhaling the scent of expensive leather and absolute corporate silence. Exactly 3 minutes later, the secure intercom located in the center of the boardroom table buzzed with a sharp, clear tone. It was my executive assistant sitting at the reception desk just outside the boardroom doors. "Ms. Harper," my assistant said, her voice crisp and entirely professional, echoing slightly in the vast room, "your 10 o'clock candidates for the fast-track management evaluation have officially arrived. They are currently waiting in the reception area. Shall I offer them some water or coffee before they come in?" I looked at the 3 empty chairs sitting across the vast expanse of the polished oak table. I thought about the scorching, brutal heat of the Nevada desert. I thought about the deafening roar of the highway traffic and the terrifying, absolute silence of being completely discarded by the people who were supposed to aggressively protect me. I thought about the 15 years of relentless, exhausting, grinding work it took to completely pull myself out of that traumatic darkness and build a life of absolute, undeniable power. "No coffee," I replied, my voice perfectly calm, completely steady, and entirely devoid of mercy. "Send them in, right now." The heavy, polished oak doors of the executive boardroom slowly swung open, making a soft, quiet swoosh against the thick, premium carpet. I remained perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair at the head of the vast table, with my hands resting flat against the cool wood. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows behind me, casting my face into deep, intimidating shadow, while entirely illuminating the 3 people walking into the room. My father, Thomas, walked in first. He was leading the pack, trying desperately to project the image of a seasoned corporate veteran, but his body language completely betrayed him. He kept tugging nervously at the cuffs of his cheap gray suit, which was noticeably frayed at the edges. His eyes darted frantically around the massive room, taking in the expensive modern art on the walls and the sweeping, dizzying view of the Seattle skyline. He was entirely consumed by the sheer magnitude of the wealth and power surrounding him. He looked incredibly small. For my entire childhood, this man had dominated our small suburban kitchen with loud, aggressive demands and a terrifying, unpredictable temper. But standing inside the heart of my empire, he was nothing more than a desperate, aging man begging for a paycheck. My mother, Susan, followed closely behind him. Her posture was stiff and highly defensive. She was clutching her faded faux leather purse tightly against her chest, like a protective shield. She looked at the polished oak table and the pristine leather guest chairs with wide, terrified eyes. Growing up, my mother had always obsessed over presenting a flawless, wealthy image to our neighborhood, despite our completely average income. She used to spend hours criticizing my posture and my cheap clothes, telling me I was a massive embarrassment to the family aesthetic. Now she was the one looking completely out of place, standing in a room that generated more revenue in a single hour than she had seen in her entire lifetime. Bradley brought up the rear. My sister Madison's arrogant husband strutted into the boardroom with a completely unearned swagger. He aggressively adjusted his flashy, patterned tie and flashed a rehearsed, empty smile. He was the absolute definition of a hollow man. He had bankrupted my parents with his ridiculous fake tech startups, but he still carried himself like a Silicon Valley visionary. He was completely oblivious to the massive financial ruin he had caused, walking into this room, believing he was about to charm the Vanguard executives into handing him a lucrative management salary. None of them looked directly at the head of the table right away. They were too busy staring out the massive glass windows, completely hypnotized by the view. They assumed the chief executive officer was just another wealthy, faceless corporate elite waiting to be impressed by their fabricated resumes. "Please take a seat," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any familial warmth or welcoming inflection. It cut through the quiet boardroom like a razor blade. It was not the terrified, trembling voice of the 16-year-old girl they had thrown onto the side of the highway. It was the heavily refined, commanding voice of a corporate titan who controlled thousands of employees and billions of dollars in global logistics. Thomas was the very first to react. He turned his head away from the window, preparing to deploy his absolute best professional smile. He looked toward the head of the table, expecting to see an older, distinguished gentleman or a stern corporate board member. Instead, his eyes landed directly on me. I watched the exact millisecond his brain attempted to process the impossible visual information it was receiving. He recognized the sharp jawline. He recognized the piercing green eyes. He recognized the face of the daughter he had brutally discarded 15 years ago. The rehearsed professional smile instantly froze on his face. All the blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. His shoulders slumped, and his hands began to visibly shake. "Harper," he whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, breathless rasp. Susan heard him say my name and immediately snapped her head in my direction. She let out a sharp, audible gasp, violently dropping her faux leather purse directly onto the floor. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the silent room. She raised a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and rising terror. Bradley looked completely confused. He glanced back and forth between his terrified in-laws and the woman sitting at the head of the table. He had never actually met me. My parents had effectively erased my existence after I left, refusing to even display a single photograph of me in their house. To Bradley, I was just the rebellious runaway sister who had broken his wonderful in-laws' hearts. He had absolutely no idea why they were currently staring at me like I was the Grim Reaper. "Welcome to Vanguard Innovations," I said smoothly, leaning back into my leather executive chair and casually crossing my legs. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of this company. I understand the three of you have traveled a very long way to apply for our entry-level packing and mid-level shift supervisor positions. Let us thoroughly discuss your professional qualifications, shall we?" The silence that followed was absolute and incredibly suffocating. You could hear the faint hum of the climate control system and the rapid, panicked breathing coming from my mother. They were completely paralyzed. The massive psychological power dynamic that had defined my entire childhood was instantly and violently obliterated. The towering, abusive father was now completely at the mercy of his discarded daughter. "Sit down," I commanded, my voice dropping an octave, leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. They moved like highly controlled puppets. Thomas practically collapsed into the center guest chair, his knees completely giving out. Susan slowly lowered herself into the chair next to him, refusing to make direct eye contact with me. Bradley sat down on the other side, still trying to maintain his arrogant posture. But the deep confusion was finally starting to crack his fake confidence. I reached forward and picked up the 3 manila folders sitting on the polished wood in front of me. I opened the first folder and looked directly at my brother-in-law. "Let us begin with you, Bradley," I said, flipping through his highly fabricated resume. "You have applied for a mid-level shift supervisor position. On your resume, you boldly claim to have been the chief executive officer of 3 independent technology startups over the past 7 years. You state that you are a visionary leader who drives massive market growth." Bradley cleared his throat, attempting to puff out his chest. "Well, yes, ma'am," he said, trying to sound authoritative. I specialize in disruptive synergy. I build companies from the ground up and optimize their corporate structures for maximum profitability. I slowly closed his folder and placed my hands flat on the table. That is a fascinating narrative, Bradley, I replied, my tone dangerously quiet. Because my corporate financial intelligence team pulled the actual public tax records for your disruptive startups. Your first company folded within 8 months, leaving 30 unpaid vendors. Your second company was sued for massive breach of contract. And your third company, which you aggressively funded by entirely draining Thomas and Susan's retirement accounts and taking out a predatory secondary mortgage on their home, officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy exactly 4 weeks ago. Bradley's face instantly flushed a dark, angry red. His arrogant smirk completely vanished, replaced by genuine, absolute panic. He looked at Thomas, desperately seeking backup, but my father was staring blankly at the table, completely broken. You are not a visionary leader, Bradley, I stated coldly. You are a massive financial liability. You are an arrogant parasite who drained your in-laws dry to fund a lavish lifestyle you completely failed to earn. And now you are sitting in my boardroom hoping to siphon a steady paycheck from my corporation to save yourself from pending civil litigation. Vanguard requires integrity and competence. You possess absolutely neither. Your application is permanently denied. Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer absolute authority radiating from my side of the table forced him to snap his jaw shut. He slumped back in his chair, completely defeated in less than 3 minutes. I smoothly slid Bradley's folder aside and opened the next one. I locked my eyes directly onto my father. Thomas slowly raised his head, looking at me with the eyes of a completely cornered animal. Now, Thomas, I said, my voice softening into a terrifyingly calm whisper, let us review your qualifications. You are applying for an hourly warehouse packing position. Under your core competencies, you actually typed the words, highly dependable leader who remains calm and fiercely protective under extreme pressure. I paused, letting those specific words hang heavily in the cold boardroom air. I remember a very specific incident regarding your leadership under pressure, Thomas. I continued leaning forward, so the morning shadows fell away from my face. I remember a scorching hot August afternoon in the Nevada desert. I remember you screaming until your face turned purple because your 16-year-old daughter asked for a 3-minute bathroom break. I remember you unlocking the vehicle doors, kicking her out onto the boiling highway, and aggressively driving away, simply to teach her a lesson about respect. Susan let out a quiet, pathetic whimper and buried her face in her hands. Is that what you consider fierce protection, Thomas? I asked, tilting my head slightly. Throwing a child into a hostile desert and driving away? Is that the kind of calm, dependable leadership you plan to bring to the Vanguard logistics floor? Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He gripped the edges of the boardroom table, his knuckles turning totally white. He was frantically trying to find a way to manipulate the situation, attempting to deploy the same psychological tactics he had used to control me for 18 years. But the massive, towering corporate realities surrounding him completely crushed his usual methods. The conflict was about to explode, from a professional interrogation into a brutal, deeply personal reckoning, and they had absolutely no escape route. The suffocating silence inside the executive boardroom stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The massive psychological wall my parents had built around themselves for decades was rapidly crumbling right in front of my eyes. The brutal reality of their past actions had finally collided head-on with their present desperation. And it was my mother, Susan, who completely broke first. Her deeply ingrained survival instincts finally kicked in, overriding her profound shock and shame. She dropped her hands from her face and frantically attempted to deploy the exact same toxic manipulation tactics she had used to control our household for my entire childhood. She forced a wide, trembling smile onto her face while hot tears rapidly streamed down her cheeks. She suddenly stood up from her leather guest chair and leaned aggressively across the massive polished oak table, reaching her hands out toward me. "Harper!" she cried out, her voice dripping with a sickening manufactured sweetness. "Oh, my God, it is an absolute miracle. My beautiful, brilliant girl. We have missed you so incredibly much. We looked absolutely everywhere for you after you left. And just look at you now. You own this entire company. I always knew you were destined for massive greatness. We are so incredibly proud of you, sweetheart." She was actually trying to rewrite history right there in the middle of my boardroom. She was attempting to completely erase 15 years of intentional neglect and absolute cruelty by playing the role of a loving, overwhelmed mother who had just miraculously found her long-lost child. It was a staggering display of pure narcissistic delusion. She honestly believed that if she just smiled wide enough and used the word family, I would immediately forget the scorching heat of the Nevada asphalt and the terrifying roar of the highway traffic. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I slowly and deliberately pulled my hands back from the center of the table and folded them neatly over their ruined resumes. "Mrs. Evans," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that echoed sharply across the vast room, "this is a formal corporate interview. Please remain securely in your seat and keep your hands to yourself." The use of her formal married name struck her like a violent physical blow. She physically recoiled, dropping back into her chair as if the leather had suddenly caught fire. Her fake smile completely collapsed, replaced by a look of genuine terror. She finally realized that the terrified, obedient teenage girl she used to verbally abuse was completely dead. The woman sitting across from her was an impenetrable corporate fortress. Thomas, seeing his wife's manipulation completely fail, decided to try a different tactic. He leaned forward, attempting to project the pragmatic, authoritative father figure. He tried to lower his voice to sound reasonable and commanding, but his vocal cords were shaking so badly he just sounded pathetic. "Harper, please be reasonable," he pleaded, gripping the edge of the boardroom table until his knuckles turned completely white. "Come on now, we are family. You have made your point. You have clearly won. You are incredibly successful, and we are very happy for you. But you have to understand the situation we are in right now. Madison is struggling immensely. Bradley lost his investors. The bank is aggressively foreclosing on our house in exactly 14 days. We are going to be completely homeless. We desperately need these jobs. You have the ultimate power to fix this entire situation with a single signature." I raised a single eyebrow, staring at the sweating, desperate man who used to terrorize my childhood. "Family," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue like poison. "Is that the specific word you want to use right now, Thomas? Because that is a very interesting concept coming from you. Tell me, since you applied for a logistics management position here, do you happen to know what Vanguard Innovation's core corporate values actually are?" Thomas stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room, unable to formulate a coherent sentence. "I did not think so," I continued smoothly. "One of our foundational corporate values is absolute accountability. It is a concept I was brutally forced to learn when I was 16 years old, sitting on the boiling concrete of a Sunoco gas station, because I dared to point out my sister's massive entitlement. You screamed in my face. You told me to learn a lesson about respect. I learned it perfectly, Thomas. I learned that you only respect power and money." "We were just stressed out, Harper," my mother interrupted, sobbing loudly into her hands. "Your father was under so much pressure at work back then. We came back for you. We drove back to that diner. We loved you." I slammed my open palm against the heavy oak table. The loud, sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, instantly silencing her pathetic sobbing. "Do not ever lie to me in my own building," I warned, my voice radiating pure, lethal authority. You did not come back because you loved me or because you felt guilty. You came back because a Nevada State Highway Patrol officer called your cell phone and explicitly threatened you with felony child abandonment charges. You came back because you were terrified of going to prison and ruining your precious country club reputation. If that police officer had not called, you would have driven all the way to California without a single second thought. Bradley, who had been sitting in absolute stunned silence on the far end of the row, finally spoke up. He looked completely horrified. He slowly turned his head, staring at his in-laws, as if he was looking at two complete strangers. "Wait a minute," Bradley said, his voice shaking with sudden, furious realization. "You are the younger sister. They told me you ran away." I shifted my gaze to Bradley. He looked like a man who had just realized his entire life was built on a massive, rotting lie. "What exactly did they tell you, Bradley?" I asked, resting my chin on my folded hands. "They told everyone you got involved with a terrible crowd," Bradley stammered, pointing an accusing finger at Thomas. "They told the entire extended family that you stole thousands of dollars from their safe and vanished in the middle of the night. They played the absolute victims for years. Madison told me you were a drug addict who broke her parents' hearts." I let out a cold, humorless laugh that sent a visible shiver down my mother's spine. "Ran away," I said, shaking my head. "Is that the pathetic fictional narrative they spun to protect their fragile social standing? They did not lose a troubled, rebellious teenager, Bradley. They dumped a minor in the desert and aggressively drove away. They locked me in the house for 2 years as punishment for surviving. And then they threw every single penny they had at Madison because she was the chosen golden child who could do absolutely no wrong." I leaned forward, locking my eyes directly onto my father. "You want me to fix your massive financial crisis, Thomas?" I asked, my tone mocking his earlier plea. "You want me to save your house, the exact situation you created by draining your own retirement accounts to fund Bradley's ridiculous delusions. You explicitly chose your investment. You invested everything you had into Madison, and you violently threw me away because I was a minor inconvenience. And now your primary investment has completely bankrupted you. That is not my problem to fix. That is the exact definition of a highly predictable return on a terrible investment." Thomas' face flushed with a sudden defensive rage. His bruised ego simply could not handle being dismantled by the daughter he viewed as worthless. He slammed his fist onto the table, attempting to reclaim his lost dominance. "We raised you," he shouted, his voice echoing loudly in the glass room. "We put a roof over your head for 18 years. We fed you and clothed you. You owe us, Harper. You owe your family." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. My quiet authority was infinitely more terrifying than his desperate screaming. "Providing basic biological shelter to a child you brought into the world is not a favor, Thomas," I replied coldly. "It is the absolute bare minimum legal requirement of biology. You do not get a gold medal for simply not starving me to death. You owe me a childhood. You owe me basic human decency. But I am never going to collect on those debts because you are entirely morally bankrupt." I stood up from my executive chair, slowly buttoning the center button of my tailored navy suit jacket. I walked around the massive oak table, approaching the 3 of them. They instinctively pressed themselves back into their leather chairs, terrified of my physical proximity. "And do you want to know the absolute best part of this entire cosmic joke?" I asked, standing directly over my trembling father. "Do you want to know how I went from a starving waitress to the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar global logistics empire?" Thomas stared up at me, his breathing shallow and rapid. "The man who rescued me that night at the gas station," I explained, my voice filled with a deep, fierce pride. "The older man in the tailored suit who bought me a hot meal and stood between us in that diner. The man who looked you dead in the eye and told you that you were a pathetic excuse for a father." His name was Harrison Caldwell. He was the founder and sole owner of Vanguard Innovations. Susan's jaw literally dropped open. Bradley's eyes widened in sheer, absolute disbelief. The very empire you are currently begging for scraps from was built by the exact man who saved me from your unhinged cruelty, I stated, letting the massive weight of that truth completely crush them. He became my mentor. He became my true father in every single way that mattered. He taught me how to be ruthless. He taught me how to build systems. And when he passed away, he did not hand this company over to a board of wealthy investors. He gave me the keys to his entire kingdom. You are literally sitting inside the house that my rescuer built. The realization hit them like a massive speeding freight train. There was no maneuvering out of this. There was no manipulating the narrative. The universe had orchestrated a flawless, inescapable trap, and they had marched themselves right into the center of it. The confrontation had completely stripped them of their pride, their lies, and their final shred of hope. Now it was time to deliver the absolute final blow and permanently close the door on the ghosts of my past. The absolute magnitude of that revelation hit the three of them like a physical shockwave, violently shattering whatever fragile illusions they still desperately clung to. The suffocating silence that followed was so profound that I could clearly hear the frantic, ragged breathing coming from my mother. They were completely paralyzed. The massive corporate empire they had walked into, hoping to siphon a comfortable salary from, was actually built by the exact same man who had stepped in to protect me from their unhinged abuse. They were not just sitting in the boardroom of a wealthy stranger. They were sitting inside a fortress built by my protector, and I was the undisputed queen of the castle. Bradley was the very first person to physically react, and his reaction was incredibly revealing. The arrogant swagger he had carried into the room completely vanished, instantly replaced by the terrified survival instinct of a selfish, cornered rat. He slowly turned his head away from me and looked at my parents with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He finally realized that the wealthy, perfect family narrative his in-laws had relentlessly sold him for years was a massive, rotting lie. They had not lost a troubled, rebellious daughter. They had maliciously discarded a brilliant teenager who had gone on to inherit a billion-dollar company. "You absolute idiots," Bradley hissed, his voice vibrating with a sudden, vicious anger. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Thomas. "You told me she was a drug addict. You told me she stole from you. You literally threw away a billionaire chief executive officer because you wanted to pamper Madison. You ruined my chances. You dragged me into this room completely blind." Bradley then frantically turned back toward the head of the table, desperately trying to salvage his own sinking ship. He leaned forward, his eyes wide with a pathetic, pleading desperation. He was entirely willing to throw his own wife and her parents straight under the bus if it meant securing his own financial survival. "Harper, please listen to me," Bradley begged, his voice cracking. "I had absolutely nothing to do with what they did to you in the desert. I did not even know you back then. I am just a collateral victim of their massive toxicity. I am a hard worker. I can divorce Madison. I can walk away from them right now today. Just give me the shift supervisor position. I can be a valuable asset to Vanguard. I swear to you, I will completely cut them out of my life." I looked at Bradley with a deep, profound sense of revulsion. He was willing to abandon the mother of his children in less than 60 seconds just to secure a corporate paycheck. He was the exact definition of a parasite. "You are a deeply pathetic excuse for a man, Bradley," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, lethal whisper. "You drained their retirement accounts to fund your fake businesses, and the second the money runs dry, you are ready to abandon your own family. You are completely devoid of loyalty, and you are a massive financial liability. I would not hire you to sweep the floors of my parking garage. Do not speak another word to me." Bradley slumped back into his leather guest chair, his face completely pale, utterly defeated by the absolute finality in my voice. Thomas, realizing that his son-in-law had just openly betrayed him and that all hope for employment was permanently dead, decided to try one last desperate, aggressive maneuver. His bruised, fragile ego simply could not handle the reality of being completely dismantled by the daughter he had always viewed as entirely worthless. He gripped the edge of the polished oak table and leaned forward, his eyes flashing with a sudden vindictive rage. "You think you are so incredibly powerful," now Harper Thomas sneered, trying to project a menacing tone that completely failed to hide his underlying terror. "You think you can just sit up there in your expensive suit and completely destroy your own flesh and blood? Fine, keep your stupid warehouse jobs, but do not think for a single second that you have won. If you throw us out onto the street, I will go directly to the press. I will call every single major news outlet in Seattle and tell them exactly who you really are. I will tell the entire world that the brilliant chief executive officer of Vanguard Innovations is a cold, heartless monster who happily let her elderly parents and her young nieces and nephews become completely homeless. I will absolutely ruin your pristine corporate reputation." I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of fear because I had anticipated this exact pathetic threat from the very beginning. I knew Thomas Evans was a cornered bully, and bullies always resort to blackmail when they lose control. I slowly reached down and opened the locked drawer of my mahogany desk. I pulled out a thick, heavy legal dossier enclosed in a premium black leather binder. I casually tossed it across the massive expanse of the polished oak table. It landed directly in front of Thomas with a loud, heavy thud that made my mother physically jump in her seat. "Open it," I commanded. Thomas hesitated, his hands shaking violently as he slowly reached out and flipped open the heavy leather cover. "That is a preemptive cease and desist order drafted by the Vanguard corporate legal team," I explained, leaning back comfortably into my executive chair. "But it is not just a standard warning, Thomas. Look at the second page." Thomas flipped the page. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he recognized the document staring back at him. "That is the official police report from the Nevada State Highway Patrol, filed exactly 15 years ago," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the quiet room. "It explicitly details how you forcibly removed a minor from your vehicle and abandoned her in a highly dangerous environment. It includes the exact testimony of the responding officers and the sworn statement of Harrison Caldwell." Susan let out a loud, agonizing sob, burying her face in her hands as the terrifying reality of the legal trap finally snapped entirely shut around them. "If you ever attempt to contact the press, Thomas," I continued, my tone completely devoid of mercy, "if you ever attempt to publicly claim relation to me, or if you ever step foot on Vanguard corporate property, my elite legal team will immediately release that police report to every major news outlet in the country. We will fundamentally destroy whatever tiny shred of social reputation you have left. And then my attorneys will bury you in a mountain of civil litigation until you cannot even afford to breathe. You will spend the rest of your miserable life fighting lawsuits you can never win. Do you understand me?" Thomas stared down at the 15-year-old police report, completely broken. The vindictive fire in his eyes was entirely extinguished. He was utterly defeated, crushed under the massive, inescapable weight of his own historical cruelty. He slowly closed the heavy leather binder and gave a single, barely visible nod of his head. I reached under my desk and firmly pressed the silent security button. Within 5 seconds, the heavy oak boardroom doors swung open, and 2 massive, heavily armed corporate security guards stepped into the room. Their presence was highly intimidating and entirely non-negotiable. "These 3 applicants are finished with their evaluation," I told the security guards, never taking my eyes off my family. "Please escort them out of the building immediately and permanently revoke their visitor access credentials." The security guards stepped forward, gesturing toward the open doors. Thomas stood up first, his shoulders completely slumped, looking like a man who had suddenly aged 20 years in 20 minutes. Susan practically stumbled out of her chair, clutching her cheap purse, weeping openly, and completely unable to look me in the eye. Bradley followed them, his head hung low in total, humiliating defeat. They walked out of the executive boardroom without saying a single word. I watched them walk down the thickly carpeted hallway until the heavy oak doors finally clicked shut behind them, permanently sealing them out of my life forever. I stood up from the massive boardroom table and slowly walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. I looked out over the sprawling, magnificent Seattle skyline. The morning fog had completely burned away, leaving a bright, crisp, brilliant blue sky. Down below on the busy city streets, I watched 3 tiny figures emerge from the massive glass doors of my building. They slowly trudged toward a public bus stop, looking entirely defeated. It has been exactly 6 months since that Friday morning in the boardroom. The bank officially foreclosed on my parents' house precisely 14 days later. They were forced to move into a tiny, cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood. My golden child sister Madison was finally forced to face the harsh reality of adulthood. She had to take a minimum wage retail job folding clothes at a local mall just to help pay their basic utility bills. Bradley, true to his selfish, parasitic nature, filed for divorce a month after the eviction, completely abandoning Madison and the children when he realized there was no more money left to drain. My father is currently working as a part-time cashier at a local hardware store. I do not hate them. Hating them would require me to actively invest emotional energy into people who are simply not worth my time. I just do not need them anymore. And discovering that incredible absolute indifference is the most profound freedom I have ever experienced. I am completely safe. I am highly successful. I am surrounded by a chosen corporate family that respects my intellect and fiercely protects my boundaries. Sometimes the people who are supposed to fiercely love and protect you are the exact same people who will happily leave you stranded in the desert simply because your existence deeply inconveniences them. Setting brutal, unbreakable boundaries with toxic family members is the hardest, most agonizing thing you will ever have to do in your life. They will call you selfish. They will aggressively play the victim. They will completely rewrite history to protect their fragile egos. But you are never required to set yourself on fire simply to keep someone else warm. When you finally stop accepting their toxic behavior and start aggressively investing in your own massive potential, you will quickly realize that you are infinitely stronger than the people who tried to break you. You can build your own empire. You can find your own mentors. You can create a beautiful, secure life built entirely on your own truth. And that is my story. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. If my journey resonated with you today, if you have ever had to walk away from a highly toxic family dynamic to protect your own peace and build your own success, I want you to know that you are not alone. You are absolutely allowed to choose yourself. Please drop a comment below and share your own experiences with setting difficult boundaries. I love reading your stories because they prove how incredibly resilient we all are. Do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more empowering stories about surviving betrayal and claiming your ultimate worth. Check out the description below for more incredible videos that I know you will absolutely love. Until next time, please protect your peace, fiercely guard your boundaries, and remember that the best possible revenge is massive, unstoppable success. Take care of yourselves. I thought the massive confrontation in my executive boardroom was the absolute final chapter of my deeply toxic family history. I had completely severed the rotting roots of my past, and I was finally enjoying the profound, peaceful silence that comes with total financial and emotional independence. But when you are dealing with a family system entirely built on a foundation of massive entitlement and deep psychological delusion, the toxic roots often run much deeper than you anticipate. The people who have spent their entire lives living off the sacrifices of others do not just walk away quietly when the free ride suddenly stops. Exactly 6 months and 2 days after I ordered corporate security to escort Thomas and Susan Evans out of my life forever, my private office intercom buzzed with a high-priority red alert. It was my head of corporate security calling directly from the ground floor lobby. "Ms. Harper," the security director said, his voice incredibly tense. "We have a highly volatile situation developing down here at the main reception desk. A woman claiming to be your biological sister has completely bypassed the standard visitor screening protocols. She is currently standing in the center of the lobby, screaming at the reception staff and loudly demanding a private audience with you. She has 2 small children with her, and she is aggressively attempting to film the security guards with her cellular phone." I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath. Madison, the golden child, the primary investment who had completely bankrupted her own parents and driven her opportunistic husband to file for divorce. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was attempting to publicly weaponize her children and her supposed family connection to force me into a deeply uncomfortable public confrontation. She assumed that because I was a highly visible corporate billionaire, I would immediately surrender to her demands just to avoid a messy public relations scandal. She was trying to play the exact same manipulative game she had played our entire childhood, but she was playing it on my absolute home turf. "Do not call the police," I instructed my security director, keeping my voice perfectly flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "Escort her into the soundproof private conference room on the ground floor. Have 2 female security officers stay inside the room with her. I am coming down right now." I did not invite her up to the executive floors. I was not going to allow her toxic energy to infect the empire I had built. I walked into the private elevator and rode it down to the ground floor, preparing myself to finally face the sister I had not seen in 15 years. When the heavy glass door of the ground floor conference room swung open, the visual contrast between the 2 of us was absolutely staggering. I was wearing an immaculate tailored charcoal power suit, radiating absolute calm and total unyielding authority. Madison looked completely unrecognizable. The spoiled, pampered beauty queen, who used to throw massive temper tantrums over iced coffees and designer dresses, was completely gone. She looked incredibly haggard, exhausted, and consumed by a bitter, frantic desperation. She was wearing cheap, wrinkled clothes, and her 2 young children were sitting quietly in the corner of the room, looking absolutely terrified of their mother's erratic behavior. As soon as I walked into the room, Madison stopped pacing and locked her eyes onto me. For a split second, I saw a flash of genuine intimidation cross her face, but her deeply ingrained entitlement quickly shoved it aside. She immediately puffed out her chest and marched toward me, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. "You completely ruined my life," Madison screamed, her voice echoing harshly off the soundproof walls. "You had all this money. You have an entire billion-dollar company, and you just sat up there in your expensive tower and watched our parents lose their house. You let Bradley divorce me. You let us become completely homeless when you could have fixed everything with a single tiny check. You are a disgusting, selfish monster." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood there and let her completely exhaust her frantic energy. Growing up, Madison had always used extreme emotional outbursts to violently bully our parents into giving her whatever she wanted. She was expecting me to aggressively defend myself or offer a frantic apology to calm her down. When I remained completely silent, staring at her with cold, clinical indifference, her aggressive posture began to crack. "Are you even going to say anything?" Madison demanded, her voice wavering slightly. "You owe me, Harper. We are sisters. My children are your family, and they are currently living in a tiny, miserable apartment because of your absolute greed. You need to buy us a house right now, and you need to set up a massive trust fund for my kids. It is the absolute least you can do after completely abandoning your own family." I slowly walked past her and sat down at the edge of the conference table, resting my hands on the cool glass. "I did not ruin your life, Madison," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "You completely ruined your own life. You chose to marry a parasitic fraud because you were too lazy to build a career of your own. You happily sat back and watched our parents drain their entire retirement savings just to keep you clothed in designer labels you did not actually earn. You are a massive financial black hole, and I am not going to throw a single dime of my hard-earned money into it." Madison gasped, her face flushing a dark, angry red. "I am going to the press," she threatened, pulling out her cellular phone. "I am going to record a video right now and tell the entire internet that the famous chief executive officer of Vanguard Innovations happily lets her own nieces and nephews starve in the street. I will completely destroy your precious corporate reputation." I let out a soft, cold laugh that made the two security guards standing by the door subtly shift their weight. "You are incredibly predictable, Madison," I replied, shaking my head. "Your father tried that exact same pathetic blackmail tactic 6 months ago in my executive boardroom. It did not work for him, and it is absolutely not going to work for you. But since you brought up the topic of complete financial destruction, let us thoroughly discuss your current situation." I reached into my suit jacket and pulled out a single folded piece of heavy legal paper, placing it flat on the glass table. "Vanguard Innovations is not just a software logistics company," I explained, locking my eyes entirely onto hers. "We also manage massive portfolios of corporate real estate, and we routinely purchase distressed commercial assets. When your ex-husband Bradley filed for his catastrophic corporate bankruptcy, his massive mountain of defaulted business debt was bundled and sold off by his desperate creditors to a highly aggressive private holding firm for pennies on the dollar." Madison stared at the folded paper on the table, a sudden look of deep confusion and rising panic washing over her face. "I am the sole owner of that private holding firm," I stated, letting the massive, absolute weight of that revelation completely crush her. "I literally own the debt that ruined your life, Madison. I own the remaining deficiency judgments from your foreclosed property. From a purely legal standpoint, I practically own you. If you ever attempt to publicly blackmail me or drag my name into your pathetic circus, my corporate attorneys will immediately execute every single one of those judgments. We will garnish your minimum wage retail salary. We will seize your meager bank accounts. We will ensure that you spend the rest of your miserable life paying me back for the damage your husband caused." Madison took 3 rapid steps backward, completely dropping her cellular phone onto the carpet. Her hands began to shake violently. The absolute, terrifying reality of my power had finally pierced through her thick wall of delusion. She realized she was not dealing with a vulnerable runaway sister. She was dealing with a corporate titan who held her entire financial existence completely in the palm of her hand. But as I looked past her trembling figure, I saw her 2 young children sitting quietly in the corner. They were watching the entire exchange with wide, terrified eyes. They looked exactly like I did when I was a helpless child, trapped in a household entirely controlled by deeply toxic adults. They had absolutely no control over the miserable situation they had been born into. I stood up from the glass table and smoothed down my suit jacket. "You are a toxic, entitled liability, Madison, and I will never give you a single penny," I said, my voice softening just a fraction as I looked at her children. "But I am absolutely nothing like the parents who raised us. I do not aggressively punish innocent children for the massive failures of the adults around them." I pulled a second document from my jacket and dropped it next to the first one. "I have directed my personal wealth management team to establish 2 fully funded educational trust accounts for your children," I announced. "Those accounts contain enough capital to completely cover their future university tuition, housing, and medical needs. But there is a massive, ironclad legal stipulation attached to those funds. You have absolutely zero access to them. You cannot withdraw a single dollar. You cannot borrow against the principal. If you even attempt to legally challenge the structure of the trust, the funds will immediately be donated to a public charity." Madison stared at me, completely stunned, unable to comprehend the massive gesture of unyielding protection. "The cycle of generational trauma permanently ends in this exact room, Madison," I declared. "Your children will have the opportunity to build a successful, independent life, but they will do it entirely without your toxic financial manipulation. Now pick up your phone, gather your children, and walk out of my building. If I ever see your face again, I will completely ruin you." Madison did not say a single word. She was entirely broken, stripped of her leverage, and completely overpowered by a sister she had spent her entire life underestimating. She quietly picked up her phone, gathered her 2 children, and walked out of the conference room. I watched them walk through the massive glass doors of the lobby and disappear into the busy Seattle crowds. That was the actual final chapter. I had faced the absolute worst elements of my deeply painful past, and I had completely neutralized them without compromising my own hard-earned integrity. Sometimes the ultimate victory is not just about completely destroying the people who hurt you. It is about aggressively building a fortress so incredibly strong that their toxicity can never touch you again, while ensuring the innocent collateral victims are protected. Thank you so much for following my complete journey. If you have ever had to break a deeply painful cycle of family trauma, please know that your immense strength is entirely valid. Setting brutal boundaries is the only way to protect your future. Drop a comment below and share how you found your own freedom. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the other incredibly powerful stories in the description below. Keep fighting for your peace, and remember that you are entirely worthy of the beautiful life you build for yourself. Just when I thought the absolute silence of my victory was a permanent fixture in my life, the universe decided to test the strength of my corporate fortress one final time. I had spent the last year completely insulated from the toxic radiation of my biological family. I was spending my time expanding Vanguard innovations aggressively across the globe and enjoying the profound peace that comes with total financial independence. I honestly believed that the massive legal cease and desist order I had slammed onto the boardroom table had permanently terrified my father Thomas and my mother Susan into complete submission. But when you are dealing with people whose entire psychological foundation is built on deep narcissistic entitlement, they do not just accept defeat gracefully. They fester in the dark and look for incredibly desperate ways to strike back. It happened in the middle of November while I was in Paris, negotiating a massive European supply chain merger. It was 3 a.m. local time when my secure mobile phone began to aggressively vibrate on the nightstand of my hotel suite. My lead public relations director, Sarah, was calling me on the encrypted emergency line. Sarah never panicked, but her voice was incredibly tense when I answered the phone. "Ms. Harper," Sarah said, skipping the standard pleasantries completely. "We have a highly critical situation developing in the domestic media sector. A controversial internet talk show host named Trent, who runs a massive digital podcast out of Los Angeles, has been aggressively promoting an upcoming exclusive interview. He is teasing a live broadcast featuring the anonymous, heartbroken parents of Seattle's most ruthless female tech billionaire." I sat up in the dark hotel room, instantly wide awake. The sheer, absolute audacity of my parents was staggering. They were completely bankrupt, living in a cramped, miserable apartment and working minimum wage jobs. They had absolutely nothing left to lose. So they had decided to completely weaponize their last remaining asset, which was their fabricated victimhood. Sarah quickly forwarded me the promotional audio clip Trent had released to his millions of subscribers. I listened to the heavily distorted voices playing through my phone speaker. Even with the digital vocal disguise, I immediately recognized the pathetic, trembling cadence of my father's voice and the dramatic, manufactured sigh of my mother. In the short promotional clip, my father boldly claimed that I was a ruthless corporate sociopath who had stolen thousands of dollars from his personal home safe to fund my initial escape. My mother chimed in, claiming they had spent decades desperately searching for their runaway daughter, only to be aggressively thrown out onto the street when they finally tracked me down to beg for a simple reconciliation. They were completely rewriting history for a massive public audience. Trent, the sleazy podcast host, had promised them a massive $50,000 cash payout for the exclusive live interview. My parents actually believed that by using digital voice distortion and remaining physically hidden behind a privacy screen in the studio, they could successfully bypass the ironclad legal cease and desist order I had explicitly forced them to sign. They thought they had found a brilliant legal loophole that would finally give them the ultimate revenge and a massive paycheck to escape their poverty. A standard corporate executive would have simply directed their legal team to file a massive injunction and block the broadcast. I could have easily tied Trent and his podcast network up in years of tedious litigation. But Harrison Caldwell, my late mentor, did not teach me to simply block an incoming attack. He taught me to completely and absolutely neutralize the entire battlefield, so the enemy never dared to raise a weapon against me ever again. I did not call my lawyers to draft a cease and desist. I called my chief financial acquisitions officer. Trent was a loud, arrogant shock jock, but he was not an independent operator. His highly lucrative podcast was officially owned by a mid-tier digital media conglomerate called Apex Broadcasting. I directed my intelligence team to perform an immediate deep-dive financial audit of Apex Broadcasting. Within exactly 2 hours, they discovered the massive, fatal flaw. Apex was currently drowning in severe server hosting debts and massive supply chain logistical failures regarding their physical merchandise distribution. They were actively bleeding capital and desperately seeking an emergency corporate buyout to avoid total bankruptcy. I completely halted my European merger negotiations, packed my bags, and flew directly back to the United States on my private jet. While I was somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, my aggressive acquisitions team officially initiated a hostile corporate takeover of Apex Broadcasting. Because Vanguard Innovations possessed billions in liquid capital and controlled the exact server hosting infrastructure that Apex desperately needed, we completely swallowed the media company in less than 48 hours. By the time my private jet touched down on the tarmac in Los Angeles, I was no longer just the chief executive officer of Vanguard Innovations. I was officially the supreme majority shareholder and the absolute boss of the exact media conglomerate that owned Trent's podcast. The highly promoted exclusive interview was scheduled to be broadcast live at exactly 8 o'clock that evening. I arrived at the massive Los Angeles recording studio at 7:45, accompanied by my elite personal security detail and my lead corporate attorney. The atmosphere inside the studio lobby was electric with anticipation. Production assistants were frantically running around, carrying clipboards and adjusting camera equipment. I completely bypassed the front reception desk, ignoring the frantic protests of the studio security guards. My own massive security team simply moved them aside with quiet, intimidating precision. I walked directly down the neon-lit hallway toward the main soundproof recording booth. Through the massive glass observation window, I could clearly see the interior of the studio. Trent was sitting behind a massive, expensive microphone, adjusting his headphones and looking incredibly smug. Sitting directly across from him, completely hidden behind a frosted privacy screen, were my father and my mother. I could see the nervous, shifting silhouettes of Thomas and Susan. They were probably practically vibrating with greedy anticipation, absolutely desperate to get their hands on that $50,000 check. I placed my hand on the heavy acoustic door handle, pushed it open, and walked straight into the live recording studio. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, instantly silencing the chaotic noise of the hallway. Trent looked up from his digital soundboard, his arrogant smile immediately dropping into a deep, confused frown. He recognized me instantly from Forbes magazine covers and corporate profiles. "Excuse me, Miss Harper," Trent stammered quickly, pulling off his headphones and standing up. You cannot be in here. We are going live to 3 million listeners in exactly 4 minutes. This is a closed, highly secure set. I did not look at him. I walked straight past his massive audio desk and walked directly around the frosted privacy screen. Thomas and Susan were sitting in cheap folding chairs, clutching their pathetic fabricated notes. When I stepped into their line of sight, the sheer, absolute terror that violently washed over their faces was something I will remember for the rest of my life. My mother let out a sharp, terrified squeak, completely dropping her notes onto the soundproof carpet. My father turned the color of old ash, his jaw literally unhinging as he stared up at the daughter he was just about to publicly destroy. Harper Thomas whispered, his voice cracking with absolute, unfiltered panic. "How did you find us? You cannot stop this. We have a legally binding contract with this network." I slowly turned my attention back to the shocked podcast host, who was frantically gesturing for his producers to intervene. "Trent," I said, my voice completely smooth and echoing clearly into the expensive studio microphones. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, Vanguard Innovations officially finalized the complete hostile acquisition of Apex Broadcasting. I am the sole owner of this network. I am your boss. And your highly anticipated broadcast is permanently canceled. In fact, your entire employment contract is completely terminated, effective immediately. Pack your desk and leave my building before I have my security team physically remove you for trespassing." Trent stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked at his panicked producers through the glass window, who were all frantically checking their mobile phones and nodding in terrified confirmation. The arrogant shock jock completely folded. He threw his headphones onto the desk, grabbed his jacket, and rushed out of the studio without saying a single word, completely abandoning my parents. I slowly turned back to Thomas and Susan. They were completely trapped inside the soundproof room with me. There was no audience. There was no massive payday. There was only the absolute, terrifying reality of the empire they had foolishly tried to attack. "You actually thought a digital voice filter would protect you from a legally binding corporate agreement?" I asked, leaning casually against the edge of the recording desk. "You thought you could completely violate the cease and desist order and simply walk away with $50,000? "We were desperate, Harper," my mother sobbed openly, weeping into her hands. "We have absolutely nothing left. We cannot pay our rent. We just wanted to survive. We did not want to hurt you. You explicitly came here to publicly brand me as a sociopathic thief," I replied, my voice dropping to a cold, lethal register. "You wanted to completely destroy the pristine corporate reputation I spent 15 years building, simply to line your own pockets. You are not desperate, Susan. You are maliciously greedy." I signaled to my lead corporate attorney, who stepped into the room, holding a crisp legal document. He placed it directly onto the folding table in front of my trembling father. "When you signed the interview contract with Apex Broadcasting, Thomas, you explicitly agreed to a standard liability clause," I explained, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "That clause clearly states that if the interviewee commits perjury or violates an existing non-disclosure agreement during the broadcast, they are completely liable for all massive financial damages incurred by the network. Since I now officially own the network, and you actively conspired to completely violate our existing legal agreement, that $50,000 payout you were promised is officially revoked." Thomas stared blindly at the legal document, completely paralyzed by the massive failure of his absolute final scheme. "But I am not stopping there, Thomas," I continued, letting the crushing weight of my unyielding authority completely suffocate him. "Because you deliberately violated the original cease and desist order, My legal team is officially executing the penalty clause. We are seizing the remaining pathetic balance of your bank accounts to cover my emergency legal fees. We are actively pressing formal charges for attempted corporate extortion. You will not see a single dime, and you will likely spend the next 3 years defending yourselves against aggressive felony charges with a public defender because you absolutely cannot afford a real lawyer. My father completely broke. He did not scream. He did not threaten me. He simply buried his face in his hands and began to loudly hyperventilate. The massive psychological wall of his lifelong narcissistic delusion completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He finally realized that he was absolutely nothing compared to the colossal, unstoppable force I had become. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Pity is reserved for victims, and they were strictly volunteers in their own massive destruction. I turned my back on them and walked out of the soundproof recording studio, leaving them completely surrounded by my corporate security team and my aggressive attorneys. I walked out into the warm Los Angeles evening air and took a deep, clean breath. That was the absolute definitive end of my toxic family. They completely vanished into the chaotic, grinding machinery of the legal system, and I never heard from them ever again. I returned to Seattle and continued to ruthlessly expand my empire. I eventually launched a massive global foundation entirely dedicated to providing full-ride university scholarships and housing assistance to teenagers who have been abandoned or emancipated from highly abusive households. I took the exact scorching pain of that desert highway and transformed it into a massive protective shield for thousands of kids who desperately need a Harrison Caldwell in their lives. You cannot choose the deeply flawed people who bring you into this world, but you have the absolute, unyielding power to choose exactly who you allow to stay in it. When toxic people realize they can no longer aggressively control you, they will desperately try to control how other people see you. Let them try. Let them exhaust themselves screaming into the absolute void while you quietly build a fortress so incredibly magnificent that their pathetic lies completely bounce off the walls. Although it is an agonizing reality to accept that the very people who brought you into this cold world might view you as nothing more than an expendable burden or a convenient scapegoat to mask their own profound insecurities and failures, you must fiercely understand that your inherent worth is never dictated by those who are too blind to see it. Rather, the ultimate lesson to be drawn from enduring such heart-wrenching betrayal and complete abandonment is that true power lies not in seeking the validation of a toxic biological family who would happily leave you stranded in the metaphorical or literal desert of life, but in having the uncompromising courage to walk away from their manipulative abuse to painstakingly build your own unshakable empire of success, total independence, and inner peace from the ground up, recognizing along the arduous journey that you always have the absolute right to construct a chosen family of loyal mentors and allies who deeply value your intellect and fiercely protect your personal boundaries, and that setting brutal, ironclad limits against those who suddenly demand to reap the glittering harvest of the seeds they never sowed is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary shield of self-preservation. Therefore, if you have ever had to permanently sever the rotting roots of your past to protect your brilliant future and transform your deepest trauma into your greatest triumph, I strongly urge you to share your own incredible journey of resilience in the comments below. Smash that like button to stand in powerful solidarity with abuse survivors everywhere, and immediately subscribe to Sophia Told Stories for more empowering narratives that boldly remind you that the most devastating revenge against those who tried to break you is simply choosing yourself and living a completely unstoppable, massive, beautiful life.